Welcome, everyone. My name is Dave-Inder Comar, and this is the Empowerment Podcast. My guest today is Yumna Kamel. Yumna is the executive director of Refuge, an NGO providing a legal lifeline for climate migrants. Alongside her executive duties, Yumna spearheads a legal advocacy project at Refuge, conducting legal research for live cases featuring elements of climate migration and raising the international legal community's awareness for the issue. Yumna is also the legal education officer at Right to Remain, where she works on resources about the UK asylum and immigration system, including the Right to Remain toolkit. Yumna was called to the Bar of England and Wales in 2020 and has an LLM from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Thank you, Yumna, for joining me. It's so exciting to be here with an expert on climate migration. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's really exciting for me to be able to spend some time with you talking about climate change, which I know is a bit of a shared passion, particularly issues related to displacement. I'd love to know some of the frontline issues that you're already seeing in your work with respect to displacement and migration challenges, with some focus on climate for sure, but also just more generally.
Sure. I think it's multifaceted. So when it comes to immigration more generally, there's a lot of us versus them. People are taking our resources sort of narrative, and there are legal frameworks and there are policy discussions that happen surrounding this topic. But when you throw climate into the mix, there is an immense lack of awareness. There's also a lot of ignorance, I think willful ignorance. Many people in policy circles don't want to talk about climate change, period. And so that bars any conversations about climate-related or climate-induced displacement, which I think makes for an overall terrifying narrative because it's not something that's going to happen in the future. This isn't an episode of The Jetsons. It's happening right now. And it's going to get a lot worse. And so if we're barring those conversations and creating an us versus them narrative, we're really reducing the timescale we have, which is already terrifyingly limited. So I think that the lack of conversation or the lack of facilitation of those conversations is the most worrying thing.
Can you explain a little bit about what is the political situation like in the UK right now? I know there's a conservative government in power. I know there's been several prime ministers. It sounds like climate change is just not part of the political dialogue. And I'd be curious to know generally what the situation is like.
So I think to date, climate policy and immigration policy are being considered separately in the UK. I think it's safe to say that. So there's been close to no discussion of the intersection. And I think where climate has overlapped with sort of more policy or security conversations, it's been a matter of national security and securitization of borders. With regards to attitudes towards immigration, period, it's really quite shocking. I think it's totally safe to say that immigrants are scapegoated in the UK much as they are in the US. And there is a huge backlog. There's a backlog of over 160,000 cases, I believe, on asylum decisions right now. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of misunderstanding, there's a lot of hatred, and that is being utilized and exploited by the government, but also press, the mainstream press. There's a lot of fear and a lot of misinformation and just a general delayed decision-making and not enough lawyers to take on everyone who is seeking asylum as well.
What's the status of the plans to send people to Rwanda for processing?
So those plans are paused, if you will. The appeal is set for the spring or early summer. And as a result of an injunction from the European Court of Human Rights, no one can be sent to Rwanda until a period of time after the final decision has been made. And by the final decision, I mean either by the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom or the European Court of Human Rights. So that won't be for a while yet. So technically the plan has been paused because the legal proceedings are considering whether the plan itself is lawful.
I mean, even if this particular scheme maybe gets struck down, could it be tried again in with some other changes?
Do you mean this notion of offshoring people?
Exactly. Yeah, this notion of offshoring people.
I don't think that it will stop, that attempts will stop with Rwanda, whether or not it's successful. And to tie it back to climate, if there are people who are, for all intents and purposes, legitimate refugees, and they are being pushed away and told that they're illegitimate and they're being scapegoated and they're not being accepted, and actually we're moving further and further away legally from the Refugee Convention, various laws, how on earth are we going to be treating people who are fleeing climate factors, which is already in and of itself a much more murky area of law, because law needs depth and checklists, right? You need to fulfill certain definitions, there's certain bullet points you need to fulfill. But if you're fleeing climate factors, there are so many things that can come into that, right? Like, are you fleeing the poverty that results as a result of a climate event? Are you fleeing gradual climate factors? Are you fleeing one large disaster? There are all sorts of things that come into consideration, and it doesn't lend itself well to current legal structures, in my opinion, which makes it all the more challenging.
Bill Gates gave a statement, I think so, a few weeks ago, saying 1.5 was basically out of the question. It's a very dispiriting commentary, and UNEP has a report that came out, I think, in December saying that we're not going to hit 1.5 without massive systems change. We need this kind of systems change if we want to avoid 1.5 by the end of 2020, the end of the 2020s or early 2030s. And I want to ask you, your thoughts on this 1.5 degree target and whether you think it's important and whether it's something we should still be striving for.
Okay. So I'm no Bill Gates or UNEP, but in my humble opinion, the 1.5 is a super important figure. One, because we're running out of time and it's already so much campaigning and work and discussions and conversations and conferences have been catered towards this one goal. And now we have even less time than we had when we began these conversations. And I think to change tack now might be more messy than it is beneficial. And I think to sort of cut back on that at this stage perhaps wouldn't be wise. And I realize that the figure is scary, but this isn't a matter of politics or choice. It's really a matter of life or death. And so we should be scared when it comes to this figure. And in terms of reducing warming, I mean, it's quite clear to me that the greatest emitters or the greatest emission comes from corporate activity, right? Corporate and commercial activity. And also, I think that the lack of legally binding requirements to curb the amount of warming is significant, and it's becoming even more significant now.
It's very difficult to see a just transition away from fossil fuels without a larger conversation about how we live collectively on the planet together. I'm curious to, about your reactions or your thoughts as to some of the biggest challenges we face in terms of making this transition away from fossil.
I actually think that one of the biggest problems we face is panic, collective moral panic. Fear is paralyzing. And I think when we aim too big as humble humans, I mean, dream big, of course, but I think when we give ourselves tasks that are too big to carry out as human beings or collectives, as opposed to sort of like on the international stage, we risk overburdening ourselves and marking out goals that we just can't reach without that sort of funding and backing. And I think to counter that, and what we've tried to implement as a culture at Earth Refuge, is to think smaller and to think community wide. Also think that education in the form of community building is extremely important. One of the first things that Steph, my co-founder, and I thought of as a pillar of this project is that we do not want to be the people with the mic, which is ironic because I'm speaking into one right now. But it's why we started our Faces podcast, to hear from people who are experiencing climate migration, because right now for people, wealthy people in Western countries, it seems like a myth. They're not going to know many people who have experienced it. And if you just hit them with the figure, 1 billion people are going to be displaced by climate in 2050, it's not hard for them to respond with, okay, but if you present them with the story of someone who is going through it verbatim, there's something about that encourages a more humane response.
Yeah. So your theory of change is basically personalizing events that are far outside the normal scope of maybe most or everyone's imagination to show how the problem is real.
Absolutely. And I also think that it's not that far away, right? So like in the UK, I mean, even in London over last summer, 2022, there were immense heat waves. Lives were lost. Services stopped running. People's houses set on fire. Highways set on fire. Year before that, there was an immense winter in Texas that no one was expecting, that no one predicted and no one was prepared for. It's a lot closer to home than we think. This isn't a Bangladesh or a Tuvalu problem. Of course, it's happening a lot quicker there, but it's not that far away. And so I don't think we necessarily have to humanize people who are thousands of miles away for people to start taking note of this issue.
What are some of the challenges you and Steph have had in building Earth Refuge and in building an NGO with such an ambitious mandate?
There have been many issues because it's such a big problem and we really care. But it's also very difficult to navigate this space because to date, we are still the only organization that is focusing on this issue, this very particular intersection, which is climate migration and legal protections. So I think entering the space and not having a specific blueprint to follow enabled us a lot of freedom, but it was also extremely daunting.
What are some of the challenges that you faced as part of being a legal professional? I mean, how is your experience as a legal professional different or more challenging than, or better, or more interesting than you would have imagined when you started to study law?
The most poignant thing for me has actually been how little people who do not have a legal background know about their legal
Okay.
rights. And that goes for sort of climate and immigration, but also just day to day stuff, rights, consumer rights. And on the flip side of that, how much gatekeeping there is in the legal profession worldwide. So the other hat I wear is as the legal education officer at Right to Remain, which is an organization that works in migration justice in the UK. And my key role is providing legal education to people who are not lawyers, but who have a support role in the lives of migrants to show them how they can support people through their cases, whether or not they have a lawyer, and also how people who are in the immigration system themselves can take control of their cases, whether or not they have a lawyer. I've realized how important it is to make the law accessible and how to trace it back to the rule of law, which is that everyone deserves to have laws that act in their favor, but also that are easy and accessible and that they're able to understand and utilize without having to use lawyers.
What are your thoughts on the current asylum scheme more generally? I mean, is this something that's going to be able to withstand the scale of the problem that you foresee? And if not, what are some avenues of improvement that you think should be looked at?
I do think that the asylum system as it stands is struggling to cope, and that's from both ends in terms of the people who are in the system who cannot get, and I speak solely for the UK, but I'm sure that some of these arguments can be transposed to other places in the world. People who are in the immigration system cannot get access to lawyers because lawyers are facing a major backlog. They cannot take any more clients. That means a lot of people are realistically navigating the system from start to finish without ever getting any legal advice. And in terms of the government departments, there is such a huge backlog that staff are having to sort of cut back on quality, on training. I can't spend as much time as they were able to before on individual decisions. There's very quick turnover as well. People have sort of temporary 3-month contracts. So by the time they start, they stop very quickly, meaning that there aren't that many senior figures in the field to look up to or seek mentorship from. There's a danger now to being a legal professional who speaks up for the rights of migrants or who represents immigrants. Because of this fear narrative, the us versus them that I mentioned at the start of our conversation, there's now a lot of targeting of lawyers and pay is not incredible. And so it doesn't take much to discourage new, fresh, brilliant legal minds from going down this route. And so I think that how the legal system is operating now is not sustainable.
Something you mentioned about just the threats to human rights defenders or the threats to people working as legal professionals in this particular space.
Right.
How do you maintain positive and mentally well outlook on things? How do you continue to feel a sense of empowerment in terms of your work and your role, given that this is the environment now that you're working in?
In terms of staying positive, I honestly think it's interaction with the people I work with. It never fails to surprise me how positive people who have been through the actual worst experiences that humanity has to offer remain so generous, so kind, so positive, and so ready to start again, no matter how many times it takes to do so. So that's what keeps me positive. And then separately, in terms of avoiding burnout, I've learned to say no. I'm still learning how to say no. It's still a work in progress, but sometimes the work gets to be so much because you are absorbing, the difficulties and the challenges that other people have faced. And it's so easy to say to yourself, well, I'm not going through it, so I don't have an excuse. But there comes a point where it does affect you. And if you don't take heed of that and take a beat and take a break, then the quality of your work will start to decrease.
I feel like I'm just living in this constant state of burnout that's like, that's lasted now for many years. Much better now at recognizing when certain red flags are being raised in terms of my own health, right? And then you just like take a break, stop, and recover and recuperate. My perspective is that where we're at in terms of the scale of the problem and in terms of the centuries that we'll need to basically re-enter some type of habitable homeostasis, the best we can do is architect a solution and then basically pass on the work to new generations who can continue that work. And hopefully they will be able to see a cooler earth. And I'm curious if you think I'm wrong or what your perspective is on that.
I have a lot of hope. I don't think I'm naive. I'm not an optimist, but I think I'm a realist. And what I can see before me is that the fight has started. I wish it didn't have to be a fight, between groups of people, but rather a fight for justice. And God, that sounds cheesy, but it's true. What you see happening is a shockingly self-aware generation below me, which is Gen Z, who are, now in university, graduating, becoming members of parliament at very young ages, enforcing policies, starting community discussions, holding governments and stakeholders to account. We started seeing court cases of, holding corporations to account and governments to account for their failures in terms of environmental and climate disasters, and also in terms of the protection that they have to enforce as this problem progresses and in order to prevent it. Of course, not all of those cases have been won, but if you would like to check them out, wow, this wasn't intentional, but if you would like to check them out, I highly recommend looking at the legal database that has been published by Earth Refuge. But I really am hopeful. The cases have started. The younger generation gives me a lot of hope. They're very mature. And because, if we say that you and I are sort of 1 degree away from experiencing the full-on impact of climate change, they are even closer than we are. And so they perhaps have even more to fight for than we do. So I have a lot of hope. The kids are doing all right. I think the beauty of nature is that things can happen and be undone quite quickly once the cycles are put into motion. And I'm not saying that we can solve global warming in like 2 decades. I'm not saying that at all. But once those cogs are put into motion, progress will be tangible. And then it will be a lot easier to get more people on board.
I was moved by what you said. I mean, that
Oh,
gave me a lot of hope. I mean, I agree with everything you said. I think you're right. I think change can happen quite quickly once the right cogs are in place. What does the world look like from your perspective when those cogs are in place? What are we doing in our daily lives? What are governments doing? I mean, do you have a vision of what the road to homeostasis, what the road to a cooling planet looks like?
I don't think it will be that big of an adjustment for us in our day-to-day lives, because I think technology has taken us, more than halfway there already, right? It's a matter of swapping out some processes for others. And there will obviously be like a testing period, right? Like whatever tech eco solutions we put forward don't have to be, or probably will not be perfect from the get-go, but they'll be better than what we have now. And then in terms of, how we function in our day-to-day lives, I don't think that we're ever going to get to a stage where humanity is like just everyone frolicking in the fields. There's always going to be some form of hate. It's just the way we are. Like pain causes that. But I really don't think it will be that drastic. But I do hope what happens is that democracy is respected more than it is currently, and that there will be more fruitful education of voting populations, and that people who are in power, this is me being a dreamer, but I hope that the people who are in power will be in power because they care about the communities they serve, as opposed to just being in power for the sake of being in power. So that's what I hope for, but I don't necessarily think that our day-to-day lives will change that much.
What would you say to somebody who is in university? What's some advice you would give to them to stay positive and feel some empowerment about this issue?
Get out of your comfort zone. I am naturally a very shy person when it comes to social settings. And I think what really got me out of my comfort zone and brought me a lot of hope when I was in university was engaging with community projects at university. So providing legal advice, joining community groups that are actually outward facing, not just for university students. It helped me meet people I never thought I would meet. It brought to light issues that I never considered. and it cast my net wider so that when I became an adult, if that is the case, my interests were wider and I had a lot more resources to tap into. People who are in university or for people who are in law school, I think it's really important to not compare yourself to other people when it comes to human issues like this. So if we're talking about climate or immigration or related factors, it's not a matter of competition or, getting the best grades or whatever, because if you're going for it in that way, then you're doing it for the wrong reasons. I think it's really important to learn humility more than anything else and to learn how to communicate with different groups of people. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to become a public speaker, but learn to interact with different people and don't think you can do it all yourself. Tap into networks if you can. Reach out to people on LinkedIn or Twitter who you think would be suitable mentors for the things you want to go into, because we learn better by listening to other people.
Yumna, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.